Hello, I'm Evan with New Life for Old Bikes. I had a viewer ask me about repairing the brakes on her old road bike. Well, for this week's episode, we're going to do just exactly that. I'm going to show you what you need to do to maintain your brakes, as well as doing a complete rebuild on a caliper. When we're done, I'm going to show you how to install your brake cables. This is a 1976 Huffy Independence. As I understand it, it's a one-year only model celebrating the bicentennial of the United States. It has a special seat as well as special decals. It's an oddity, but I doubt it's particularly valuable. By the way, if you have any information on this particular bike, please let me know in the comments below. I would be very curious to know more. Road bike calipers come in three common styles. The first is more commonly found on road bikes through the 1980s and the 1990s. They can also be found on all-terrain mountain bikes of the same vintage. Some will have a quick release, like the one found on this much newer second design. The third style is a center pull brake design. It has a separate hanger for the barrel adjuster. This is the barrel adjuster right here. The barrel adjuster is used to increase the tension on the cable. This hanger will be on the top of the fork on the front of the bike, or be hanging from the seat post clamp on the back of the bike. The cable drops through the barrel adjuster right here and connects to the straddle cable via a clamp. The straddle cable connects the two sides of the brake caliper. The first thing I'd like you to notice is just how loose this front caliper is. First thing we need to do, there's the problem. The first thing we need to do is snug up this top bolt. We don't want it too tight. We want the brake to move smoothly. There we go. Then we're going to take two wrenches. We're going to hold the back nut with one of them and tighten the front with the second. This particular brake caliper required a 10 millimeter and a 12 millimeter wrench. However, you could just as easily do this with a crescent wrench. With the amount of space that I have between the brake pad and the wheel, when I press the brake handle, it almost touches the handlebar. Unfortunately, if I were heading downhill at any kind of speed, I'd probably grip that very tightly and pull it right to the handlebar. The way we're going to solve this is by loosening this barrel adjuster. I'm using a 10 millimeter wrench to do this, but you could easily do this with a crescent wrench. I'm then going to loosen the barrel adjuster about 5 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch. We're going to test that. The brake handle moves no more than halfway, so we're going to go ahead and tighten that barrel adjuster now. And test it one more time to make sure nothing moved. Perfect. Next, we're going to test the back brakes on the bike. If you'll notice, the brakes are not pulling evenly. In fact, this side of the bike is clamped against the wheel. The wheel doesn't even want to spin. First thing I'm going to do is take off this wire tie someone put on here and see if that doesn't solve the problem. Since that didn't solve the problem, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to loosen the nut on the back of the brake and center the brake over the wheel. Then we're going to snug it back up. Next, we'll test it to see if that doesn't solve the problem. Bingo! Problem solved. I noticed the handle on the back brake was very stiff compared to the front. So, we need to test the brake to see if the stiffness is in the brake or in the cable. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen this barrel adjuster and turn the adjuster all the way in. The reason I'm doing that is so I have a little more room to move the brake. The brake moves freely, so the problem is going to be in the cable itself. Since the brake cable isn't moving smoothly, we're going to disconnect the brake cable from the bike and determine if there's a problem. Over the years, it could have gotten dirt in there, moisture could have gotten in there and the cable could be rusted, or it could have a frayed cable. This is where we're going to find out. We're going to take either a 10mm wrench or a crescent wrench and we're going to loosen this cable clamp. Once we have it loosened, we're going to pull it out. Next, we're going to pull the cable housing away from the brake handle. Next, we're going to wiggle the cable out. I want you to notice just how stiff this cable is. I believe when it's all over, we're going to be replacing this. What I found was surface rust on the cable. This will compromise the outer strands of the cable and ultimately they'll break. What I'm going to do at this point is put in a new cable and I'll add a little bit of grease to it so that this doesn't happen again. There are several things that I did off camera. They're probably not of particular interest to watch, but you do need to know what they were. I cleaned and waxed the head tube and the top tube on the bike. I cleaned the brake handles, and then I cleaned the outside of the original cable housing. Once I finished with that, I sprayed some penetrating oil through the cable housing to make sure that there was no dirt and debris left from the old cable. The next thing I did is I actually ran the cable through the housing to verify that it was in fact smooth. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to grease the cable. We're going to put a light film of grease, and what I've done, I'm measuring how much will be in the cable, and I want to make sure that the grease goes no further than the end of the cable. The reason is I don't want any grease on the cable clamp. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to slide the cable ferrule back onto the cable. The purpose of this is to simply prevent the cable from folding over. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to slide the cable back into the housing. I know this is a little hard to see, but inside this handle is a keyway. What you're going to do is feed your cable through the opening in the front and connect it behind the keyway, and that will hold your cable in place. If I were cutting a brand new cable housing for this bike, I would be measuring from my brake handle to my brake caliper and make sure I have plenty of length so that the steering can turn all the way and not interfere. The tool I use for this is a cable cutter, but you could easily use a pair of wire cutters or diagonal cutters and they'll work just as well. Once our cable clamp is tightened, we're going to go ahead and test the brakes. We want to make sure the brake pads are between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch. In other words, 1 to 3 millimeters away from the wheel. To adjust this, we're going to back out this barrel adjuster. Once we have the proper spacing between the brake pad and the wheel, we should also have plenty of room on the brake handle so you can pull down on it without the brake handle touching the handlebars. Now we're going to cut the cable off. We're going to leave approximately 1.5 inches past the caliper. Normally my finishing touch would be to put an end on this cable and to crimp it in place. But we're not going to be doing that today because the plan is to rebuild these calipers. At the beginning of this video, we discussed doing the maintenance on your brakes so they would operate properly. We also discussed replacing a cable. The last thing we need to cover is rebuilding a caliper. For this job, you will need either a 10mm wrench or a crescent wrench. The first thing we're going to do is loosen the cable clamp. Then we're going to pull out the cable. The next thing you'll need to do, if you're working on the front of the bike, you'll be removing the nut from the back of the fork. If you're working on the back of the bike, you'll be removing it from the frame. The next thing we're going to do is lay our caliper on a clean towel. There's two reasons for this. The first reason is if we drop a part, it won't go bouncing across the table and hit the floor. I hate chasing parts. The second, and probably the most important reason, is so I don't scratch my wife's antique table. Next, we're going to use the 12mm wrench to hold the back nut on the front of the brake. Then we're going to use the 10mm to loosen the front nut. This can sometimes be a bit of a pain in the neck. Lay out all your parts in order so you don't lose track of them. Off camera, I did several things. I cleaned up all the parts. In this case, the parts are chrome plated or an alloy, so I went ahead and cleaned them with some steel wool and then waxed them. I also waxed the fork of the bike to make sure that was nice and clean under the brake. One thing I'd like you to notice are the brakes off the front of the bike. This particular front brake has no tread on it. And like your tires, you'll get the best grip when it has tread on it. I'll be replacing these. Two things to be aware of. Had the brakes been very rusty, I would have used a penetrating oil on all the bolts. I would have let it sit about 2 hours before breaking them loose. The other thing, if the brakes had been either a black anodize or had been covered in grease, I would have used a degreaser and a toothbrush to clean them up. One suggestion I'd like to make for you. As you disassemble, make sure you get photographs of the parts. That way it's a whole lot easier to put back together. This happens to be a waterproof marine grease. The reason I'm using that is this won't come off when you ride through the rain, or when you wash the bike for that matter. Remember to tighten the lock nut on the front, just like we did before. The last thing we need to do is put in the barrel adjuster. Make sure you have it going in the right direction. We're going to put on the brake shoes or brake pads, but we're not going to tighten them down. The reason is when we put it on the wheel, we'll have to adjust them. There we go, one fully assembled brake caliper. If we were to rebuild the other two styles of calipers, they would be very similar. The newer style of caliper, we would remove this nut and this nut right here, and as you can see, it has one spring in it, very similar to what we already rebuilt. If we were to rebuild the center pole caliper, we would remove these two bolts right here, and instead of having one spring, it has two. Off camera, I cleaned up the front brake cable as well as the cable housing. When I was done cleaning it, I sprayed a little bit of penetrating oil through the housing just to make sure there was no dirt or debris that would impede the movement of the cable. I've already wiped a thin layer of grease on the cable and reinstalled it. The next thing we're going to do is put the caliper back on. Make sure you snug it up. You want it tight enough so that it's not going to back off, but loose enough so that the brake still moves freely. The next thing we're going to do is reinstall the cable. We're going to slide it through the barrel adjuster, which, by the way, I have backed the barrel adjuster off approximately 1 turn, and we're going to slide it through the cable clamp. Lastly, I'm going to go ahead and tighten the nut on the cable clamp. I try to mount the brake pad as close as I can to the inside of the wheel. The reason I do that is if the bike ever hits a curb, the outside could have a dent in it, and I don't want to feel a bump, bump, bump every time I hit the brake. The easiest way I've found to adjust the brakes is to hold the brake pad in the correct position and clamp down with the brake handle. Once you've got it clamped in place, snug it up. Then, with the brake handle off, tighten it the rest of the way. Perfect. I hope this video has helped you feel more comfortable adjusting your brakes or rebuilding your calipers. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. And don't forget, like and subscribe.